Hi, everyone. This week we are moving to the unit on poetry. So I wanted to record a short video on reading poetry, some of the differences it entails versus what we've been reading up to this point, which is fiction. And that should hopefully get you started on the first round of readings you're to do for this week. And we'll spend a couple weeks on poetry. Hopefully you find some new poets or poems that you enjoy. So poetry is something that people tend to loathe or love. There's often not a lot of middle ground within poetry and poetry reading. And some of us might have dabbled in poetry writing. I certainly have. I wrote a lot of bad poems in high school, and I continue to write bad poems now, although I hope that I'm getting a little bit better. They very rarely see the light of day. But poetry is an intense form of literature in that it is often much shorter than fiction or drama, and that it is meant to be read aloud, which is also similar to what we see with drama. And poems sometimes have a reputation of being rather stuffy, using languages, analogies, figurative language that is archaic or hard to understand. People sometimes feel as though it's a riddle or a puzzle that they need to be solving, and then they can't get it, and then they get frustrated. So we ask ourselves the same questions of poetry as we do with drama and fiction. We take a look at things like setting and character and tone and sometimes plot. Sometimes there's not a plot in a poem. Sometimes it's just an observation. But there is some kind of takeaway usually in great works of poetry. As the bottom bullet there says, poems aren't as fragile as we make them or take them to be. We can only kill them by not reading them. So by reading them, we keep them alive. And what I have tried to do in this class is focus on poetry that is a little bit more modern, a little bit more current, so as not to hopefully have you run screaming away from it and read something that is possibly a little bit more relevant to where you are in your lives right now. So I always encourage people to read poems aloud. So as you are assigned various poems, and because poems are much shorter than the short stories you've been assigned previously in the fiction unit, you might be reading 10, 20, 30 poems in 1 week, but they are going to be a lot shorter. And so I would ask that you read them aloud to yourself at least once, or if you're shy about that, almost all of these poems will be available online in various websites like poets.org, poetry.org, Poetry Foundation. There are lots of websites for poetry, and you can often just Google an author's name and the poem title and find it. So try to listen to it read aloud, because it helps you understand line breaks and pauses. And because poems are read aloud, how they are delivered can affect how we interpret them. Some of the poems that we will dive into later, like the poems by Sylvia Plath, if you listen to Plath read them herself, she's almost flippant and arrogant in her readings of them, and that might change the way you read the actual words themselves. So try when you can to read them aloud or listen to them being read aloud. So it is a form of literature, as we said. Sometimes it's rhymed. More often than not, especially in modern poetry, it isn't rhymed. It has a specific pattern. Older poems, like if you think about poetry by Shakespeare, the sonnets, there's a definite rhyme scheme. There are a number of syllables per line that the poems stick to, and they are very, very structured. And as we move into later generations of poetry, the structures fall away. You have poets like E. Cummings and Emily Dickinson, who came along and said, no, I don't need to stick to those rules and that structure. I can put dashes here. I don't have to capitalize anything. I can smush words together. I can break them wherever I want to. So they played with the form and therefore the function of poetry and the way that it is read. And so sometimes when we come across poems by these poets in particular, they can be harder to read and harder to read aloud because they don't follow our natural cadence of speaking and because they are rather disjointed. But there's a purpose behind where a poet chooses to stop a line by the words that the poet chooses. If you think about how distilled down a poem is, it's only often, 12 to 20 lines, and every word in that poem was carefully chosen by the poet. So there's a reason why it's there. And they have the entire English language and the English dictionary at their discretion. but they chose a particular word. And if you start to notice patterns like repeated words, if you start to notice the figurative language like similes and metaphors, it will help you get a richer understanding of what's going on in the poem. So when you look at poetry, you can usually easily identify it by the fact that it is not always punctuated like literature is. There are a lot more line breaks. There's a lot more white space around the poem. I'm staring at a poem right now in our Norton anthology, and it's usually a couple stanzas. Stanzas are those lines that are grouped together, and if there's a break, it becomes a new stanza. So that helps you also understand where to break, where to take a breath, and sometimes in longer, more narrative poems, it can reveal different stages in a story that's being told. So when we think about poetry, again, we want to read it aloud, listen to the cadence. Sometimes, even though it doesn't appear to rhyme, there's a definite repetition of syllables, sometimes called alliteration. There is areas of the poem where there is emphasis placed. Sometimes the poet might italicize or bold or dash something. And then think about how you respond personally as you read or have the poem read to you. Do you like it? Do you hate it? Do you get confused by it? Do you love it? Is there an image that pops in your mind? Does it make you recall a memory that you once had? And then that can help you build your understanding and even appreciation of the poem. So I have us referencing two different poems in our textbook, and they're short, so I'm gonna read them aloud to you and then briefly talk about them. The first one is by Billy Collins, and it's on page 742. Billy Collins was the poet laureate of the United States a couple years back. He's still living and he's still writing poetry. You can catch him on various TED Talks and YouTube videos. He's kind of a funny little guy who doesn't really present well. He never hardly makes eye contact with his audience, but he's got a wry or dry sense of humor, and I like a lot of his stuff. So this poem is called Divorce. Once 2 spoons in bed, now tined forks, across a granite table, and the knives they have hired. That is only 4 lines. It is 2 separate stanzas, and the title of the poem is Divorce. So we know that the poet, Billy Collins, is equating 2 lovers as spoons in bed, and often we are relating to the fact that people spoon when they're cuddling. And now, instead of being those cuddled spoons, they are the tined forks, if you think about how forks all have the 4 tines on them. So they're separate. There's no cuddling happening. And across the granite table, we're keeping it in the kitchen setting, that continuing that metaphor, and the knives they have hired as an analogy for lawyers. So there is a separation of the couple. And it's simple, but we immediately understand the point he's making. And if I go to the second poem, Head Heart, on page 732, this is by Lydia Davis. Head, Heart is the title of the poem. Again, it's short. It's all 1 stanza and 10 lines. Heart weeps. Head tries to help Heart. Head tells Heart how it is again. You will lose the ones you love. They will all go, but even the earth will go someday. Heart feels better then, but the words of Head do not remain long in the ears of Heart. Heart is so new to this. I want them back, says Heart. Head is all Heart has. Help, Head. Help, Heart. So in this poem, we have what is often a conflict between logic and reason that we possess in our brains and feelings and emotions that we feel in our literal or conceptual, figurative hearts. And sometimes the two agree and sometimes they don't. And we know logically we will lose people and we know that it will hurt, but it doesn't make it less painful. And so the use of commas in this poem is important because there's a plea, help, Head. She's pleading for the head to help. Help my heart. Help my heart understand. My head might, but my heart doesn't. So there's this interplay of organs in our bodies that help us to process and understand pain. So 2 very, very short poems dealing with love and loss and using analogies and some repetition and some line breaks in Collins' poem. So look for those parts of the poem that sing to you, if you will. Look for the ways in which it makes you feel something, because often it will. It might not always be a pleasant feeling, but poetry is evocative. I love poetry for what it can accomplish in such brief language, how it can punch you in the gut and bring a tear to your eye in so few words and so few lines, and tell a story that is complex and commonplace that we all feel, and do it in such brevity. So think about the diction that the poem has, what the poet chooses for the words that he or she uses. Look for words or images that are repeated. Those have some significance or importance. And if there is any change that occurs in the poem. When we talk about sonnets by Petrarch and Shakespeare, there's often a turn in the sonnet at about line 9 or 10, I believe, where something shifts. Like that would be the climax in a work of fiction. Not all poems are going to do that, but some will. Look at the connotation of the words. All words have dictionary or literal definitions, but all words also have connotative or cultural definitions. Often I'd use the example of a snake. A snake literally is a reptile, but if you call someone a snake, you're calling them untrustworthy and sly, devious, and it's affiliated in the Western culture with the Bible and the devil and evil, if you will. So oftentimes the words that the poet uses, the images that he or she chooses, have connotative meanings. If there are words you're unfamiliar with, check them out on Google. Do a define colon in the word, and Google will give you a nice history of the word, how it's evolved, and the meaning of it. And often those words do have multiple meanings. That's what makes poetry kind of like a puzzle and kind of fun. Good poems have figurative language. They have similes, metaphors, irony, oxymorons, alliteration, and sometimes rhyming. So bad poetry will rely on stale or cliched, overly done, just kind of what you might hear in a bad 80s pop song. They will rely on those tired old phrases. Good poetry, worthy of a literary textbook, is fresh and innovative and new, and makes you see something in a new way. It makes you look at something like a lilac that's been around forever and we all know what it is. Makes you see it and smell it and feel it in a different way. So in these slides, and I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed through this last part, but you're going to note again figurative language. Metaphors are direct comparisons, whereas similes use like or as, and there are, hopefully in the poetry that we're reading, strong uses of figurative language like similes and metaphors. We can use personification when we give human-like traits to things that aren't human. So we humanize the heart, even though it's just an organ that is keeping the blood pumping through our body. We have associated it with the center of our feelings, though that's probably centered up here too. But we have, throughout our history, given the heart this special place to make it more important. And often there is this feeling of a conflict between logic and feeling, and sometimes feeling wins. Allusions, if you read poems that reference back to other poets, other times in history, we see this often in speeches that our officials make. They allude to previous presidents or heads of state that were good orators or good writers, and we see this also in poetry. There will also be symbols. If you take psychology, you're probably used to studying what certain symbols mean, and we can apply those same rules here. If we're looking for some kind of extra meaning behind something, we can think about colors. White is often associated with purity and innocence, as is pink. Red is associated with passion and love, anger. Green is associated with abundance and fertility, but also with envy. And so those are colors, but there are also, birds and flags and all kinds of things that can represent a symbol for something else in a poem. So take note, look out for those. There are subgenres of poetry. We will read a few different kinds in this next couple of weeks. And some of the poems have no narrator. They have a named narrator. There are a couple different characters. Often we don't know who the narrator or the author who is speaking in the poem is. And one thing I would caution you against with all literature that you read is don't assume that the author is the narrator of the poem. Don't assume that the author feels the same way that the characters and a piece do, because we can be creative, we can write works of fiction, complete, made up